For Keanu Reeves, the ocean has always been a place of peace and refuge, where the noise of the world dissolves into the rhythmic roar of the waves. That day, walking along the coast, he enjoyed the salty breeze and the cries of seagulls flying over the water. Everything seemed quiet and serene. Suddenly, he heard a scream. A piercing, desperate voice cut through the air. Keanu stopped abruptly, turning his head in the direction of the sound. A man and woman couple stood on the shore, their arms outstretched, their desperate eyes staring into the ocean. Keanu looked in the same direction, and his heart sank. A small boy, no older than 6 years old, on a small inflatable raft was quickly moving away from the shore. The waves were relentless, and the child looked terrified, clutching the edges of his only support. And Keanu already knew what he had to do. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden fingers across the shoreline, casting a warm glow over the quiet coastal town. The waves lapped gently against the sand, rhythmic and soothing, a soft hum beneath the sounds of distant laughter and the occasional call of a seagull. The beach, nestled between towering cliffs, remained relatively untouched by the usual tourist crowds. Here, the ocean ruled, vast and endless, a silent force of nature beyond control. Keanu Reeves walked along the water's edge, his steps slow, unhurried. The cool water washed over his feet, sinking him slightly into the wet sand with every step. He welcomed the solitude, the escape from the ever-present noise of the world beyond this secluded place. The weight of expectations, of the artificiality of fame, did not exist here. The ocean did not care who he was. The waves would come and go, indifferent to the burdens he carried. He had spent years seeking places like this, places where the world did not demand his attention. There was something about the sheer vastness of the sea, its ability to swallow sound, that brought him peace. His breath matched the pull of the tide, in and out, steady, unwavering. The sun hung lower now, the sky painted in streaks of amber and violet, a quiet farewell before nightfall. He had no particular destination in mind, only the desire to walk, to feel the salt air on his skin, to let the moment exist without expectation. Farther down the beach, a family had settled near the water, their laughter carried by the wind. A father and mother sat on a picnic blanket, watching their young son play in the shallows. The boy, no older than 6, ran back and forth between the waves and the shore, his feet splashing as he giggled with unfiltered joy. He held onto a small, inflatable raft, dragging it behind him, its bright colors stark against the deepening hues of the ocean. Keanu's gaze flickered to them briefly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was something universal in the simplicity of it, a child's delight, a parent's quiet watchfulness. A scene that could belong to any time, any place. He turned his attention back to the horizon, his thoughts drifting like the tide, aimless and unburdened. The wind shifted, a subtle change, barely noticeable at first. The waves grew slightly more insistent, their once gentle lapping now pressing with a touch more urgency. The shift in the air was instinctual, an unspoken warning only those who knew the ocean well could sense. Keanu stopped walking, his feet sinking deeper into the damp sand as he turned his head slightly, scanning the horizon. The child, still clutching his inflatable raft, had ventured further into the water. Each small wave lifted him higher, pulling him farther from the shore. The laughter that had once filled the air was now distant, thinner. The boy's movements slowed, hesitation creeping into his once carefree motions. He turned back toward the beach, but the tide had already taken him further than he realized. The water deepened, the pull of the current subtle but relentless. His parents hadn't noticed yet. They were still seated on the blanket, engaged in quiet conversation, oblivious to the shifting tide. The boy's arms moved more frantically now, trying to paddle back toward shore, but the inflatable did not obey his will. Instead, it tilted slightly, and he gripped its sides tighter, panic creeping into his wide eyes. Keanu's pulse quickened, though his expression remained unchanged. He had seen this before, how quickly a moment of play could turn into something else entirely. The boy was small, his limbs untrained for the deceptive strength of the ocean. The tide did not care for innocence, nor did it heed the cries of those who struggled against it. Then the scream came. The mother's voice, sharp, panicked. Her gaze had finally snapped to the water, to the small figure that was now much too far from where he should have been. She scrambled to her feet, her hands reaching out uselessly, as if she could will him back to safety with nothing but desperation. The father followed, stumbling into the water, calling out his son's name, but he stopped short when the waves reached his waist. He was already out of his depth. The boy was beyond his reach, beyond any frantic splashing that could hope to bring him back. Keanu was already moving. His feet pounded against the wet sand, his breath measured, focused. The water surged around his ankles, then his knees, then his waist. The cold hit like a sudden shock, but he did not hesitate. With a single, powerful push, he dove forward, breaking the surface with strong, practiced strokes. The waves resisted him, pulling, pressing, trying to deter him, but he was relentless. His body cut through the water, each motion precise, his focus unwavering. He knew how to move with the ocean rather than against it, how to let the current guide his strength rather than waste it. The boy was flailing now, his small hands gripping the raft so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Keanu could see the fear in his eyes, the rising panic that threatened to pull him under. The raft tilted dangerously as another wave lifted it high, and for a brief moment, the boy was nearly submerged. A choking gasp escaped him as he surfaced again, his breath ragged, his strength fading. Keanu reached him just as another wave threatened to push them further apart. His hand closed around the edge of the inflatable, steadying it, anchoring them both. The boy gasped, eyes locking onto Keanu's, filled with something between relief and terror. He clung to the raft, trembling, his small body shivering from fear and cold. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. His grip was firm, his presence steady. He adjusted his hold on the raft, shifting his weight to keep it balanced. The boy's breathing slowed slightly, his panic ebbing just enough to allow Keanu to begin the arduous journey back. The shore was farther than it had seemed. The tide had pulled them out quicker than the eye could track. Keanu could hear the shouts of the parents, faint against the roar of the ocean, but they were distant, powerless to help. It was just him, the boy, and the relentless expanse of water between them and safety. He began to swim, kicking with controlled, powerful strokes, keeping one hand on the raft at all times. The waves continued their assault, trying to push them off course, but Keanu adjusted with each shift, never losing momentum. The boy remained frozen, still clutching the raft, as if it were his only tether to life itself. The muscles in his arms burned. His lungs worked harder against the salt-laden air, but he didn't stop. He knew exhaustion could not be allowed to settle in, not yet. Every movement had to be deliberate, efficient. The ocean was not an enemy to be fought, but a force to be understood, navigated. The shallows came into view. He could see figures rushing into the water now, the father wading as deep as he dared, arms outstretched, waiting. Keanu pushed forward, his final strokes bringing them into reach. The boy was lifted from the raft, snatched into his father's embrace, held so tightly that he whimpered against the crushing relief. Keanu stayed in the water for a moment longer, breathing deeply, his body heavy with exertion. He watched as the mother collapsed onto the sand, sobbing as she clutched her son, pressing frantic kisses to his wet hair. The fear had broken now, spilling out in waves of its own, though these waves carried only relief. He turned back toward the horizon, watching as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The tide was still pulling, still whispering its quiet, indifferent song. The ocean remained as it always had, vast, untamed, neither cruel nor kind. Keanu exhaled slowly, stepping back onto the sand. He had done what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. The wet sand beneath Keanu's feet felt solid, anchoring him in reality as he stepped further away from the water's grasp. His breaths were deep, measured, his chest rising and falling steadily as he allowed exhaustion to settle into his limbs. The ocean still roared behind him, waves breaking against the shore as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just tried to claim another life. A few feet away, the parents clung to their son, their bodies forming a protective barrier around him. The boy was shaking, his small fingers curled into his mother's soaked dress, his face hidden against her chest. The father's hand rested on the child's back, unmoving, his grip tightening every few seconds as if he needed the physical confirmation that his son was truly there, breathing safe. Keanu watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Relief, gratitude, the aftershocks of fear. All of it radiated from them in waves as powerful as those that had nearly swallowed the boy. But something in Keanu's gaze remained distant. He had been in this moment before in different places with different people. He had seen the way terror left its mark, the way it lingered long after the immediate danger had passed. A crowd had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. A few onlookers murmured among themselves, some holding their phones as if debating whether to capture the moment. Others simply stood in stunned silence, as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. The mother was the first to move. Slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and brimming with tears as she turned toward Keanu. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, her gaze searching his face for something. Understanding, reassurance, maybe even forgiveness for not having been fast enough to reach her son herself. Keanu gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that no words were needed. The father, still crouched beside them, exhaled shakily before finally speaking. His voice was raw, hoarse. "You saved my son." Keanu said nothing at first. His gaze flickered to the boy, still trembling in his mother's arms. The child was silent now, no longer crying, but his small body shook with the remnants of fear. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice quiet, steady. He held on. The father let out a shaky breath, nodding, as if that simple statement was enough to ground him. He turned back to his son, pressing his lips to the top of the boy's damp hair. The mother reached out then, as if on instinct, gripping Keanu's arm with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the words. "I don't know what would've." She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Keanu just shook his head. "He's safe now." Her grip tightened for a second before she finally let go. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone finally recognized him. His name passed from person to person, whispered in awe, disbelief. The realization spread quickly, faces shifting from shock to astonishment. The weight of recognition settled over him, as it always did, unwelcome and inevitable. "Is that? Oh my God, it's Keanu Reeves. I can't believe he just—" Did anyone get that on video? Keanu exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. The last thing he wanted was attention. This moment wasn't about him. It never had been. A woman pushed through the small crowd, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Mr. Reeves, can I?" He was already stepping away before she could finish. He wasn't here for that. He wasn't here for the cameras, the headlines, the inevitable flood of praise that would follow. He had done what anyone should do. That was enough. The parents turned back to their son, cocooning him once more, whispering reassurances as if their words alone could erase the memory of the waves pulling him away. Keanu took one last glance at them before turning toward the edge of the beach, moving past the gathering spectators without another word. The sand clung to his wet clothes, his footsteps slow, heavy. The wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of salt and the distant hum of crashing waves. He kept walking, away from the voices, the questions, the growing whispers of his name. The adrenaline that had carried him through the moment was beginning to wane, leaving behind a strange emptiness. It wasn't exhaustion, not entirely. It was something deeper, something heavier. He reached a secluded part of the beach where the cliffs cast long shadows against the sand. Here there were no crowds, no cameras. Just the endless stretch of ocean before him, its vastness unchanging, its power unchallenged. He stood at the water's edge, watching as the tide pulled away from the shore, retreating as if nothing had happened. The ocean didn't care. It had almost taken a life today, and yet it moved on, indifferent, unconcerned. There was no malice in its nature, only inevitability. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the waves, to his own breathing, to the quiet that had finally returned. He had done what he could. That was all. And yet, something inside him remained unsettled. The night had settled over the coastline by the time Keanu finally left the beach behind. The waves continued their eternal dance, crashing against the sand with the same rhythm as before, indifferent, unmoved. The distant glow of streetlights barely touched the dark waters, but he could still hear them, could still feel the phantom weight of the ocean pressing against him. His clothes were still damp, the salt clinging to his skin, a lingering reminder of the struggle. Every muscle in his body ached, not just from the swim, but from the weight of everything that had followed. The boy was safe. That was all that should have mattered. But as Keanu walked toward his car, away from the distant murmurs of the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. The voices had begun to die down. The parents had taken their son home, holding him tightly as if afraid the tide might reach out and reclaim him at any moment. The gathering of onlookers had slowly dispersed, some still glancing back, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had seen. A few had tried to approach Keanu, but he had kept moving, unwilling to turn a moment of survival into a spectacle. He reached his car and leaned against it for a moment, running a hand through his damp hair. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind the exhaustion that always came after something like this. It wasn't just physical. It was deeper than that, a quiet, heavy thing that settled in the spaces between his ribs. For years, he had lived with that weight. He knew its shape well, had carried it through countless moments of loss and quiet grief. But tonight it felt different. He exhaled and reached for the door handle, but before he could pull it open, a voice called out from the shadows. "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu turned, his expression unreadable. A woman stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together, uncertainty in her stance. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't asking for a picture. That alone was enough to make him pause. "I'm sorry," she continued, stepping forward hesitantly. I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to say thank you." She wasn't the boy's mother. That much was clear. She looked younger, maybe mid-20s, with wind-blown hair and an expression that carried something more than just gratitude. Keanu nodded slightly. He's safe now. That's what matters. The woman exhaled shakily, glancing toward the ocean before looking back at him. "I know. I was watching the whole time. I couldn't move. I wanted to do something, but she shook her head, frustrated with herself. I froze." Keanu studied her for a moment. He had seen that look before, the guilt of inaction, the self-reproach that came after fear had stolen the ability to act. "You weren't the only one," he said finally, his voice even. She flinched slightly, but there was no judgment in his tone. Just truth. The ocean did that to people. It made them realize how small they were, how powerless. She nodded, understanding. I don't think I'll ever forget it." Neither would he. The woman hesitated, then took a small step forward. "I don't mean to keep you. I wanted you to know that it meant something. That what you did, it wasn't just saving him. It was showing the rest of us that maybe, if something like that ever happens again, we could do something too." Keanu said nothing for a long moment. The waves filled the silence between them, whispering against the shore, retreating and returning, just as they always had. Finally he nodded. "Take care." The woman smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the dim glow of the streetlights. Keanu watched her go before finally opening his car door and sliding inside. The leather seats were cool against his damp clothes, the familiar scent of worn upholstery grounding him back into something close to normalcy. He sat there for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, but he didn't start the car right away. Instead, he let himself sit in the quiet, let himself breathe, let himself feel the weight of what had just happened. The ocean had almost won tonight. Almost. But not this time. Not this time. The weight of the night settled heavily over the coastline as Keanu finally turned the key in the ignition. The engine's hum filled the car, a stark contrast to the silence that had accompanied him for the past few hours. The roads were nearly empty now, the world having moved on, as it always did. Yet, for him, The echoes of the ocean and the boy's terrified eyes had not faded. He didn't head home right away. Instead, he drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past in streaks of gold and white. His body ached from the ocean's relentless pull, but his mind refused to still. The moment played over and over. The father's outstretched arms, the mother's helpless cries, the child's fragile grip on the inflatable raft, his own body cutting through the waves, pushing against the ocean's force. A red light stopped him at an empty intersection. Keanu ran a hand down his face, feeling the roughness of dried salt on his skin. He was used to moments like this, to solitude pressing in after something raw had taken place. It had been this way for years, acting on instinct, then withdrawing, trying to process what it meant to have been there, to have done what needed to be done. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, breaking the quiet. He picked it up, expecting another round of messages, another flood of praise he had no interest in responding to. Instead, it was a single text from an unknown number. "You saved my son. I don't know how to thank you." Keanu stared at the message, knowing it had to be the boy's mother. He could almost hear her voice from earlier, thick with tears, trembling with the weight of a fear she would never forget. He typed slowly, then hesitated before sending. "You don't have to." There was nothing else to say. No thanks was necessary. No repayment was needed. The child was alive. That was enough. The light turned green, and Keanu exhaled before pulling forward, the city stretching out before him. Days passed, but the ocean's pull did not loosen its grip on his mind. He went about his usual routines, quiet mornings, motorcycle rides through the hills, afternoons spent reading in the shadowed corners of bookstores where few recognized him. But there was a shift now, a subtle change he couldn't quite define. The weight of the moment lingered, pressing into the spaces of his thoughts when the world around him fell quiet. The news had spread faster than he had anticipated. Articles, interviews, videos dissecting every second of the rescue. He avoided them. He had always been wary of attention, preferring his actions to speak for themselves. But the world was insatiable, always hungry for more, for stories that could be consumed and then discarded when the next moment of fascination arrived. He ignored the calls from media outlets, declined invitations to appear on morning shows, let the reporters write whatever they wanted. He didn't care about the headlines. The ocean had taken so much from him before. This time he had taken something back. Then, on an overcast afternoon, a knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He rarely had visitors. Fewer still knew where to find him. He considered ignoring it, but something in the quiet insistence of the sound made him move. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see the boy's mother standing there. She looked different now, not frantic, not trembling, just quiet, her expression carrying the weight of something unresolved. Her hands were clasped in front of her, gripping a small envelope. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, shaking her head as if realizing she had no real reason to be there. "I didn't mean to intrude." Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply stepped aside, an unspoken invitation. She hesitated before stepping in, her movements careful, uncertain. The inside of his home was simple, almost bare, filled only with the essentials, a reflection of a man who had long learned to live with little. She glanced around briefly before turning back to him, pressing the envelope into his hand. I needed to see you, to say thank you properly." Keanu looked down at the envelope, then back at her. "I told you don't have to." "I know," she admitted. "But I needed to." She exhaled, glancing toward the window where the gray sky stretched over the city. "I keep thinking about that day. How close it was, how fast everything happened." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of standing there and realizing I couldn't reach him." Keanu remained silent, listening. Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "I was powerless." He understood that feeling too well. She looked at him then, searching his face for something. "You weren't. You didn't hesitate." Keanu shook his head slightly. "I just moved." She nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense. Then, after a long pause, she finally spoke again. "I don't want to be powerless again." There was a quiet determination in her voice now, something raw and honest. "I want to learn," she continued, "to swim, to understand the ocean, to never be in that position again." Keanu studied her, considering her words. He had seen many reactions to near tragedy: relief, guilt, fear. But this was something else entirely. A resolve to take control, to turn helplessness into strength. She glanced down, as if embarrassed. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." Keanu exhaled. "Because you mean it." She looked up again, surprised by his certainty. He opened the envelope she had given him. Inside was a simple drawing, a child's work, uneven lines and bright colors. It was the ocean, vast and deep, and in the middle of it, a man swimming toward a small figure on a raft. A moment captured through the eyes of the boy who had lived it. Keanu ran his fingers over the paper, something tightening in his chest. "My son drew it," she said softly. "He calls you the man who swims with the ocean." Keanu smiled faintly at that. She sighed, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I should go." He didn't stop her. Some moments were meant to be left as they were. She hesitated at the door before looking back. "If I find a way to learn, to swim, to really understand the water, would you teach me?" The question hung between them, uncertain, unexpected. Keanu considered it for only a second before nodding. "Yeah." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if that answer alone had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you," she said again, this time with something lighter in her voice. Keanu watched as she stepped out into the fading light, her silhouette disappearing into the gray afternoon. He closed the door, but didn't move for a long time, still holding the child's drawing in his hands. The ocean had almost taken something that day, but in the end, maybe it had given something back too. The days that followed drifted by in an unusual haze. Keanu found himself returning to the ocean more frequently, his mind carrying the weight of the boy's frightened face, the desperation of the parents, and the quiet resolve in the mother's parting words. He had spent his life witnessing how people coped with fear. Some buried it, some ran from it, and others, like her, faced it head-on, determined never to feel powerless again. The ocean was calmer today, a deceptive kind of calm. The waves rolled in slow and steady, the sun glinting off the surface, painting the water in hues of gold and sapphire. Keanu walked along the shore, his bare feet sinking into the cool, wet sand. He had always been drawn to the ocean, but after that day, it felt different, less like an escape and more like a reminder. He spotted her before she saw him. The boy's mother stood at the water's edge, her gaze locked on the horizon. She wasn't just looking, she was studying, observing. Her posture was stiff, like someone trying to will themselves past their own fear. She wore a simple tank top and athletic shorts, a towel slung over one shoulder. When she finally noticed him, her expression flickered between surprise and something else, something unreadable. "You came back," Keanu said, stopping a few feet away. She nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. "I said I would." There was no hesitation in her voice, but he could see the way her fingers gripped her arms, the way her body tensed when a stronger wave crashed near her feet. The ocean was still an adversary to her, not yet something she trusted. "You ready?" he asked. She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "I have to be." Keanu stepped forward, motioning toward the shoreline. "Come on." They started with the basics. The water lapped at their ankles as he walked her through the fundamentals, the way the currents worked, how the tide pulled, the way the ocean could change within moments. He taught her how to read the water, how to recognize when it was safe and when it wasn't. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't just about learning for her. It was about reclaiming something that fear had stolen. After a while, they moved deeper. She was hesitant at first, her breath catching when the water reached her waist. Keanu could see the way her muscles tightened, her hands clenching and unclenching as if she was fighting the instinct to turn back. "Breathe," he told her calmly. "Don't fight it. Let it move with you." She exhaled slowly, nodding. She was trying. That was enough for now. They spent hours in the water, practicing floating, treading, moving with the current instead of against it. She was cautious but determined, every small success adding to her confidence. And Keanu, who had never been one for teaching, found himself invested in her progress, in the way she refused to let her fear win. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, they finally waded back to shore. She was exhausted, but there was a spark in her eyes now, a quiet triumph. She dropped onto the sand, stretching out her legs, staring at the waves. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted. Keanu sat beside her, watching the horizon. "But you did." She smiled, shaking her head. "Only because you were here." He didn't respond right away. The truth was he hadn't expected to feel this connected to the situation, to her determination, to any of it. He had saved people before, on screen in stories, but real life was different. It stayed with you in ways that scripts never could. She turned to face him. "Why did you do it?" Keanu looked at her, confused. "Do what?" "Run into the water that day. You didn't hesitate. You didn't even think." "Why?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because I've lost people before, and I know what it feels like to not be able to save them." Her expression softened. She didn't press for more. She just nodded, understanding more than words could convey. For a while, they sat there in comfortable silence, the sound of the waves filling the spaces between them. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the same as it had always been, as it always would be. But something had changed. This time, it no longer felt like a place of loss. This time, it felt like something worth holding on to,